Welcome, traveler, to another quiet journey through time with me, your sleepy historian. This is Boring History for Sleep, a space where old stories are whispered slowly so that your mind may settle, wander, and in time, gently drift into rest. If this kind of calm bedtime storytelling helps you relax, feel free to like the video and subscribe, only if it truly brings you peace. Let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from and what hour of the night it is for you. There is something strangely comforting in imagining others scattered across the globe, all lying back and falling asleep to the same soft-spoken history documentary. Together, in this quiet moment, we form a hidden community of night listeners, united by nothing more than a wish for rest and a love of forgotten tales. Tonight's story is woven around one of the most enduring legends of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Some say they were one of the seven wonders, a cascade of greenery rising above the baked earth of Mesopotamia. Others whisper that they may never have existed at all, that they were more myth than memory. This gentle exploration will not rush to prove or disprove, but rather unfold the possibilities, slowly and softly, as though turning the worn pages of a manuscript. Over the next 2 hours, we will drift through 4 distinct scenes of Babylonian life and legend. First, we will slip quietly into the daily rhythm of the city, its sounds, its markets, its flowing rivers, and rising walls. Imagine yourself wandering slowly through those ancient streets, noting the textures of clay and reed, the scent of grain and incense. Second, we will linger on a figure, King Nebuchadnezzar II, whose name often drifts through the story of the gardens. Calmly, we will follow the patterns of his reign, not in drama or clamor, but in the steady beat of years and monuments. Third, we will step into the shadowed world of mystery and archaeology, the puzzle of the gardens themselves. Did they stand in Babylon or somewhere else entirely? Stones whisper, tablets hint, yet certainty always slips away like water through fingers. And finally, we will contrast the stillness of elite life, palaces, feasts, and shaded courtyards, with the unending labor of those who made such visions possible. Farmers, craftsmen, and slaves, whose hands shaped history though their names were lost. This is not a tale told for thrill or spectacle. It is a soft history sleep story, crafted for bedtime relaxation and gentle reflection. There will be no hurry here. The details will flow at a pace meant for drowsy minds, offering relaxing history to fall asleep to, whether you stay with me until the end or drift away much sooner. So now, make yourself comfortable, dim the lights, set your worries aside, and allow the past to unfold quietly, like a dream of long-lost gardens. Let the ancient rivers murmur, let the myths grow softly around you, and let us begin. Imagine yourself stepping slowly into the streets of Babylon. Long ago, in the centuries when the city's fame spread like a ripple through the ancient world. The air is warm but not oppressive in the early morning, carrying with it the mingled scents of damp clay, crushed herbs, and the faint sweetness of date palms swaying near the riverbanks. This is a city built from the very earth on which it stands. Bricks pressed from clay, hardened in the sun, stacked into walls that seem to stretch endlessly across the horizon. The rhythm of life here is steady, measured, almost hypnotic. You hear the soft shuffle of sandals against dust-packed streets. Merchants begin to set out their wares. Jars of sesame oil, heaps of onions, and baskets filled with barley. Potters line up their newly fired vessels, still faintly warm, their surfaces etched with simple patterns that catch the light. The sounds are subdued, yet constant. The splash of water being poured into clay basins, the creak of wooden carts, the faint bleating of goats being herded toward the shaded pen. Babylon's streets were not narrow alleys alone, but broad avenues too, straight and deliberate, radiating outward like the careful strokes of a scribe. The famous processional way, lined with baked brick and bright glazed lions, would eventually draw travelers to the great Ishtar Gate. But even beyond that monumental path, countless smaller lanes wound quietly between houses of mud brick, whitewashed to reflect the heavy sun. Their doors were simple reed mat curtains, their rooftops flat, often doubling as sleeping spaces when nights were hot. Families would climb the stairs and lie beneath the open sky, watching the stars, stars that Babylonian priests had charted with meticulous care, noting the wandering paths of planets and the cycles of the moon. Inside the houses, daily life unfolded with the slow persistence of necessity. Bread was the staple, thick loaves baked on clay hearths, often eaten with dates or onions. Stews simmered quietly, filling the air with the aroma of lentils or chickpeas flavored with garlic and coriander. Beer, brewed from barley, was poured into tall jars and drunk through reed straws to filter out the floating husks. The diet was humble, repetitive, yet sustaining a rhythm as constant as the sunrise. And always the river, the Euphrates, flowed beside the city, a steady current that dictated survival. Its waters were lifted by wooden shafts, counterweight poles that swung with a soft creak as buckets dipped and rose. Farmers guided irrigation channels by hand, coaxing streams of water across the fields. Without this river, Babylon would have been little more than dry dust. With it, the land bloomed with barley, wheat, flax, and the tall, swaying reeds that grew along the banks. These reeds were not only useful for mats and baskets, but also for writing. Cut into styluses, pressed into clay tablets, leaving wedge-shaped impressions that became records of trade, law, and even poetry. As you drift through this world, notice the pace. Life was neither hurried nor idle. It was simply continuous, unbroken. The people of Babylon rose with the dawn, worked through the heat of day, and ended their labors as the sun dipped low. In the evenings, the streets cooled. Families gathered at their rooftops, priests prepared offerings to their gods, and scribes by lamplight pressed stories into clay. Even the act of recording daily grain rations had a kind of quiet dignity, for these were the details that sustained the city thread by thread in its vast tapestry of life. Imagine yourself pausing at a small shrine along the street. Offerings of bread and incense rest before a clay figurine of a protective spirit. The smoke rises in thin, curling lines, carrying with it the hopes of a family. Health for their children, safety in childbirth, success in trade. Religion was not something distant or abstract. It was woven into each gesture, each daily act. The gods were everywhere, in the river's rise and fall, in the shifting winds, in the stars that glittered across the night sky. Yet for all the grandeur that history often ascribes to Babylon, its daily existence was not one of constant splendor. Most of its people lived modestly, in homes that were practical rather than beautiful. Their days were filled with toil, grinding grain, hauling water, tending fields, shaping clay. The wonders that reached the ears of foreign travelers, the towering walls, the glittering gates, perhaps even the legendary gardens, rested on the labor of countless unseen hands. And in that steady labor lay the true rhythm of Babylon, a heartbeat of quiet persistence, of lives lived one after another, across centuries in patterns that rarely changed. So, as you walk these ancient streets in your mind, let your pace slow. Let the steady footsteps of the Babylonians accompany your breathing. The markets, the river, the hum of daily work, all of it blends into a soft, continuous murmur. A murmur that, if you listen closely, sounds not unlike the gentle lull of sleep itself. Imagine the city a little later in the day, when the sun has climbed higher and the rhythm of Babylon is fully awake. The morning stillness gives way to a quiet bustle, not hurried but steady, as though each person moves in time with an unseen drumbeat. The streets are fuller now. Merchants stand beside stalls shaded with reed mats. Their voices rise and fall, bargaining softly over the price of fish brought in from the river or of wool sheared from sheep grazing on the city's outskirts. The goods are humble, yet varied. Imagine a table lined with clay jars sealed with bitumen, each holding sesame oil with its faint, nutty fragrance. Nearby, stacks of woven reed baskets hold dates, their skins wrinkled and sticky sweet. Another stall offers lumps of salt, traded from distant marshes. And in a corner, a metal worker sits cross-legged, hammering slowly at a piece of bronze. The sound rings with a steady, measured rhythm, not loud, but insistent, as if marking the hours of the day. Trade in Babylon was not confined to its walls. Goods came in along the great rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, that tied the land together like blue threads through sand. Boats carved from wood and bound with rope drifted slowly downstream, carrying grain, wool, fish, and sometimes even exotic goods from faraway places. Timbers from Lebanon, stones from distant mountains, and perhaps spices carried along long caravan routes. The city was alive with these exchanges. Every object told a story, not only of the person selling it, but of countless others who had touched it along the way. If you pause by the edge of the market, you notice the scribes. They sit at low wooden tables, clay tablets laid flat before them. Each transaction is carefully pressed into wet clay with a stylus. Names, quantities, weights, and agreements. The marks may seem small, yet they hold the power of law and memory. Even the sale of a humble basket of barley might be preserved in clay, surviving for thousands of years. The scribe's work is unhurried, their strokes deliberate, each wedge-shaped symbol a quiet testimony to the persistence of order. Further along, the craftsmen shape the raw materials of the land into tools and vessels. Potters, their hands dusted with fine clay, spin wheels slowly, pulling tall jars into form. Basket weavers bend reeds until they creak, twisting and binding them into shapes both practical and elegant. Leather workers cut strips of hide, smoothing them carefully, while carpenters chip at wooden beams, their movements measured and methodical. These sounds, the scrape of wood, the splash of clay, the soft rustle of reeds, form the quiet music of the city's labor. And then there are the temples, rising like mountains above the smaller houses. Their stairways climb steadily upward, their walls painted in faded colors, their shadows stretching across the market at midday. Priests walk deliberately, their robes brushing the ground, carrying offerings of bread, incense, and small vessels of oil. The gods were thought to dwell within these towering structures, and their presence was never far from the lives of ordinary people. A farmer might leave a measure of barley in thanks for water on his fields. A merchant might whisper a prayer for safe trade journeys. The gods were part of each transaction, silent partners in every exchange. The daily flow of Babylon extended beyond buying and selling. Water carriers moved steadily through the streets, balancing jars on their shoulders, droplets spilling and darkening the dusty ground. Children played quietly in shaded courtyards, rolling clay balls or chasing each other in simple games. Their laughter was not piercing but light, blending with the background hum. Old men sat at doorways, weaving small mats, their movements repetitive and calm. And women prepared meals, their hands grinding grain in stone querns with a motion that seemed endless, a rhythm passed from one generation to the next. If you follow the streets outward, you find the city walls, thick, towering, and imposing. Beyond them stretches the open land, fields crisscrossed with canals. Farmers bent beneath the sun guide cattle pulling wooden plows, their pace unchanging. The soil, though heavy with labor, is fertile, and the promise of grain ties the city's survival to the countryside. These fields are not silent. Birds wheel above, their cries sharp in the wide air, while frogs croak in the marshes fed by the canals. Even here, the rhythm is continuous, water flowing, hands working, lives unfolding. And always, when evening begins to descend, the city slows once more. Merchants gather their goods, scribes smooth clay tablets, craftsmen set aside their tools. The streets grow quieter, though never fully silent. Lamps flicker to life in doorways, casting pools of golden light. Families gather together, eating from shared bowls, telling quiet stories, listening to the faint notes of music from lyres and flutes. Music was a companion to the Babylonians, gentle and steady, carrying through the warm night air. It was not performed for spectacle alone, but as part of daily life, songs to accompany labor, melodies for rituals, and soft tunes for evening rest. In this way, Babylon was not only a city of kings and wonders. It was a living place filled with ordinary rhythms, trade, craft, family, faith, each piece small on its own, yet together forming a vast and enduring whole. Imagine yourself walking once more through its streets, feeling the worn clay beneath your feet, hearing the blend of voices, tools, and music. Nothing is rushed, nothing clamors for attention. The city simply breathes, and in its breathing, you may find your own slowing, steadying, ready to drift toward rest. As the day stretches toward evening, the daily rhythm of Babylon takes on a different tone, still steady, but marked by transition. The harsh brilliance of the Mesopotamian sun softens into long shadows, casting the city's walls in a golden glow. The great ziggurat rises above it all, tier upon tier, like a mountain built by human hands. Its summit catches the last light, turning its bricks into a warm amber as darkness approaches. Life in Babylon was tied closely to ritual. With each setting sun came small acts of devotion, gestures that reminded the people of their place in the cosmos. Imagine priests moving through the temple courtyards, their robes whispering against stone floors. They light incense in bronze burners, the smoke rising in thin tendrils, carrying prayers upward. Others pour libations, oil, milk, or sweet wine, onto the earth, offering nourishment to the unseen powers. Even the simplest family followed their own small rituals, setting aside a piece of bread before eating, whispering thanks for the grain, hoping for another harvest. The city lived not only by hours, but also by seasons. In the spring, the rivers swelled, fed by rains and distant mountain snows. Their waters spread into canals, replenishing the soil. Farmers celebrated planting, their songs lifting into the clear skies. In the heat of summer, fields shimmered, demanding constant irrigation. Laborers bent over channels, their bodies reflecting the patience of centuries. In autumn, the harvest filled granaries with barley and wheat, the true wealth of Babylon. And in winter, when the air grew cooler and rains returned, families stayed close to their hearths, repairing tools, weaving mats, and telling stories to children. Each season had its rhythm, predictable yet never taken for granted. Festivals punctuated this yearly cycle, bringing the community together in both solemnity and joy. The New Year festival, known as Akitu, was the most important of all. For days, the city filled with processions. Statues of gods were carried from their temples, borne slowly through the processional way, passing beneath the bright, glazed animals of the Ishtar Gate. Imagine the hushed awe of crowds watching, children perched on their parents' shoulders, the air alive with drums and flutes. Yet even this grandeur was not frantic. The steps of the priests were measured. The chants flowed in a steady cadence, echoing against the baked brick. The entire city seemed to move in one slow, unbroken breath. Night came gently, settling over Babylon like a soft cloak. The streets grew quieter as fires burned lower, their smoke trailing into the darkness. On the rooftops, families lay on mats, the day's heat still radiating from the clay beneath them. The sky above stretched vast and unbroken, filled with stars. Babylonian astronomers, perched on temple towers, watched these stars with unwavering patience. They recorded their movements on clay tablets, noting each shift, each cycle, each planet wandering its path. For them, the night sky was both a calendar and a mystery, a language written in light, waiting to be understood. Imagine yourself lying on such a rooftop, listening to the soft murmur of voices drifting from nearby houses. Somewhere, a flute plays a slow, winding tune. Somewhere else, a child giggles softly before sleep claims them. The city is not silent, but its sounds are gentle, blending into a steady lull. The distant splash of the river can still be heard, mingling with the occasional bray of a donkey or the low call of a night bird. And beneath this stillness lies something deeper, a sense of endurance. For all the fragility of individual lives, Babylon itself persisted, its bricks, canals, and rituals binding generations together. The same stars that guided the astronomers would return night after night. The same river would rise and fall with the seasons. The same chants would echo in temples, long after one priest replaced another. It is this continuity, the rhythm of the ordinary, that truly define the city. So, let us linger here for a moment longer in this imagined Babylonian night. Feel the warmth of clay beneath your hands. See the sky stretched wide with constellations. Hear the faint rustle of reeds in the evening breeze. The city is calm, steady, enduring. And as you let this vision settle in your mind, allow yourself to share in its rhythm. Slow, patient, unbroken, like the quiet breathing of someone already drifting into sleep. If daily life in Babylon was a steady rhythm of labor, trade, and ritual, then its great rulers were the ones who left marks large enough to echo through the centuries. Among them, one name surfaces again and again when whispers of the Hanging Gardens arise. Nebuchadnezzar II. Imagine the scene in the year 605 BCE. A young man stands at the threshold of power, not yet weighed down by the decades of rule ahead of him. Nebuchadnezzar was the son of Nabopolassar, a king who had helped free Babylon from Assyrian control and lay the foundations of a new empire. The young heir grew up in a city that was still healing from centuries of conflict, yet also brimming with possibility. When Nabopolassar died, Nebuchadnezzar was far from home. He had been commanding armies, leading Babylonian forces against rivals in the north and west. Upon hearing the news of his father's death, he hurried back across the desert to claim his throne. Picture that return. A column of soldiers moving slowly under the sun, dust rising with each step, the young leader at its head, aware that the weight of a kingdom now rested on his shoulders. Nebuchadnezzar's reign would stretch for more than 40 years, and it would become one of the most significant periods in Babylon's history. But at its start, he was above all a man of ambition. His early years as king were defined by campaigns, calmly but persistently pressing Babylon's influence outward, expanding its borders into lands that had long resisted its reach. Cities like Jerusalem felt his armies at their gates. For the Babylonians, these campaigns were not only about conquest, but about security. Each victory promised tribute, resources, and stability for the heart of the empire. Yet Nebuchadnezzar was more than a commander. He understood that empires could not endure on the edge of constant battle. What gave Babylon its lasting fame were not only its armies, but its walls, its temples, and its monuments. From the very beginning of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar turned his attention toward building, a passion that would come to define him. The city itself became his canvas and brick his medium. He ordered the repair and strengthening of Babylon's mighty walls, making them thick enough to deter any enemy. He restored the processional way, so that during festivals the people might walk in dignity beneath images of lions and bulls, creatures sacred to their gods. Most famously, he reconstructed the Ishtar Gate, adorning it with brilliant blue glazed tiles, on which shone reliefs of dragons and bulls in orderly ranks. Imagine the sight, sunlight catching on those shining tiles, the images alive with color, giving the impression of divine guardians watching over the city. In these projects, we see the character of the king. He was determined, methodical, and above all enduring. His works were not hurried gestures meant to impress in the moment, but vast undertakings meant to last for generations. Brick after brick, wall after wall, he shaped Babylon into a city that seemed to embody permanence itself. At the same time, Nebuchadnezzar never forgot the river that made Babylon possible. He sponsored canal works and irrigation projects, ensuring that water flowed to the fields and gardens. These improvements were not only practical, but symbolic. They demonstrated that the king's power extended even to the natural world, bending the river to the needs of the people. In Babylon, water was life, and by controlling it, Nebuchadnezzar presented himself as the guarantor of survival. Imagine him walking through the city he helped expand. The markets bustle as always, but now beneath walls stronger than before, and along streets more carefully paved. The priests offer incense in temples that gleam with fresh restoration. The people see a ruler not only of war, but of construction, a king who both defended and beautified their city. And somewhere, perhaps in these early years, a legend began to form, of gardens built not merely for utility, but for wonder, terraces rising with greenery above the dust. The stories say Nebuchadnezzar created them for a queen longing for her homeland. Whether truth or fable, the idea fits the rhythm of his reign, for he was a builder above all things. His monuments were not just structures of brick and stone. They were messages meant to be remembered. Thus the young king, newly seated upon his throne, embarked on a reign that would stretch across decades. Calmly, steadily, he pressed outward with armies, then inward with builders, reshaping Babylon into the marvel that history would whisper about long after the bricks had crumbled. In this way, Nebuchadnezzar's biography begins not in dramatic gestures, but in steady persistence, the same quality that defined the city itself. Nebuchadnezzar II's reign stretched for more than 4 decades, an astonishing length of time in a world where wars, disease, and unrest often cut short the lives of rulers. To imagine such a span is to imagine generations growing up under his rule. Children born at the start of his reign could have seen their own children running through the streets of Babylon by the time the old king's life drew toward its close. His presence, his policies, and his projects became a constant, woven into the very fabric of the city. In these years, Babylon flourished as the centerpiece of a sprawling empire. Tribute flowed steadily from subject lands, grain, wool, timber, metals, filling the city with wealth. Caravan routes brought goods from even farther afield. Merchants in Babylon could see ivory from Africa, cedar from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan. The city became a hub not only of power, but of exchange, its walls containing treasures from across the known world. Yet Nebuchadnezzar himself was remembered less as a lover of luxury than as a ruler who directed wealth toward building. His vision was one of permanence. He restored older temples with fresh brick and shining decoration, as though determined to bind Babylon's present with its past. Each act of restoration was a declaration that Babylon's gods were honored, its traditions secure, its people watched over by divine favor. The ziggurat, known as Edamanenki, believed by some to inspire later legends of the Tower of Babel, was among the structures he either built or restored. Imagine its 7 rising stages, each one smaller than the last, climbing toward the sky. Its base was massive, covering an area larger than a city block. From afar, it must have seemed like a man-made mountain, its summit disappearing into clouds. For the Babylonians, such a structure was not simply stone and brick. It was a bridge between earth and heaven, a place where gods might descend and mortals might ascend in ritual. Nebuchadnezzar's patronage of this ziggurat spoke to his ambition to link the name of his city with eternity itself. And then, in quieter corners of history, the legend of the gardens takes root. Later writers, centuries removed, would tell of terraces rising high, watered by ingenious systems of pulleys and channels, shaded by trees not native to Mesopotamia. These gardens, they said, were built for Nebuchadnezzar's queen, who longed for the green mountains of her homeland. Though the evidence is elusive, the story reflects something true about the king. His reign was not only about strength and permanence, but about the capacity to impress, to astonish, to provide symbols of wonder that outlasted memory. The queen most often connected to the gardens was said to come from Media, a land of rugged hills and verdant slopes. Imagine her arriving in Babylon, a city of immense walls and wide streets, but also of dust and flat horizons. The longing for mountains would have been natural, a yearning for home. The story says Nebuchadnezzar sought to ease this longing, not with words, but with stone and greenery, raising a mountain where none had been. Whether or not this happened as described, the legend itself shows how people viewed the king, as a man whose will and resources could reshape the very landscape. Beyond monuments, Nebuchadnezzar's later reign was marked by administration. He strengthened Babylon's position not only through walls and temples, but through systems of governance. Officials collected tribute, managed irrigation, and oversaw the storage of grain. Scribes, under royal authority, recorded these movements, ensuring that the flow of wealth and resources was not left to chance. The king's power, then, was not just visible in brick, but in order, in the steady hum of bureaucracy that held the empire together. Yet, as with all long reigns, there were shadows. The Bible remembers Nebuchadnezzar differently, not as a patron of temples and walls, but as the conqueror of Jerusalem, the destroyer of its temple, the one who carried exiles into Babylon. From that perspective, he was a figure of fear and devastation. This duality is important. To his own people, he was the builder king, the restorer of order. To others, he was a symbol of conquest. Both images are true, depending on where one stood. Still, within the quiet flow of Babylon itself, his presence was steady, even reassuring. Imagine the old king walking through the processional way during the Akitu festival, the people bowing their heads as he passed. They had known him for decades. His face, lined now by time, was familiar, a constant like the walls themselves. In his long reign, Babylon became not just a city of bricks and markets, but the heart of a remembered world, so powerful in imagination that its name still drifts through our own stories thousands of years later. Nebuchadnezzar's life reminds us that history is not only battle and conquest. It is also the slow laying of brick upon brick, the careful tending of canals, the steady funding of temples, the enduring patience to leave behind a city greater than the one inherited. Whether or not the gardens were ever real, his reign ensured that Babylon itself would become a legend, half truth, half dream, suspended between memory and myth. When a ruler reigns for more than 40 years, the passage of time itself becomes one of the greatest challenges. At the beginning of his kingship, Nebuchadnezzar II was a young man of energy and ambition, leading armies across deserts, inspecting walls, and directing builders. By the later years, the pace of his life slowed, as it does for all who grow older. Yet even in this slowing, the same pattern of persistence defined him. The Babylon he left behind was not the same as the one he inherited. When he first returned from campaign to claim the throne, Babylon was powerful, but not yet the wonder of the world. Decades later, his projects had remade the city. The Ishtar Gate stood as a brilliant entrance, its blue-glazed walls glowing in sunlight. The processional way was paved and adorned, ready each year for the Akita festival. Temples have been restored, ziggurats raised, canals redirected, palaces strengthened. Brick by brick, Babylon had been reshaped into a vision of stability and majesty. In his later years, Nebuchadnezzar was less often seen leading armies. Instead, he became the figurehead of continuity, the embodiment of a long reign that many of his subjects had known their entire lives. Imagine a Babylonian child, born in the middle of his kingship, who would grow to adulthood without ever knowing another king. For such people, Nebuchadnezzar was not merely a ruler. He was the rhythm of their world, a constant presence like the walls that encircled the city or the river that sustained it. The stories say that Nebuchadnezzar grew more introspective with age, perhaps even troubled by dreams and visions. Later traditions outside Babylon would remember him as a king struck with bouts of madness, wandering away from his throne, humbled before regaining it. Whether or not this happened as told, the memory suggests how powerful his image became in the imagination of later generations, a ruler so mighty that even his struggles were magnified into legend. In Babylon itself, the records are calmer. They speak of building projects, dedications to gods, and steady governance. What mattered most, perhaps, was the legacy he knew he was leaving. He inscribed his name on countless bricks, sometimes in long lines of cuneiform, sometimes simply stamped. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. These marks were not hidden, but built into the very fabric of walls and gates. To walk the city was to walk among his signatures. The king had woven himself into the city's very structure. And in this way, even after his death, he would remain. As his reign stretched into its later decades, the empire he had helped forge began to feel the weight of time. Administrations grew complex, tribute burdensome, subject peoples restless. Yet Babylon remained strong enough, enduring under his careful order. His successors, however, would not carry his vision with the same steadiness. Within a few decades of his passing, the empire would falter, and Babylon itself would fall to the rising power of Persia. The city that he had built to stand for eternity would enter a new chapter, one not under the rule of his descendants. And yet, even in decline, Babylon carried the weight of his reign. Foreign conquerors walked through gates he had restored. Priests still chanted in temples he had rebuilt. Farmers still drew water from canals he had commissioned. His presence lingered not only in memory, but in stone, brick, and ritual. Even when others ruled, the shadow of Nebuchadnezzar stretched across the city. The legend of the Hanging Gardens continued to grow long after his time. Later writers, centuries removed, would point to Nebuchadnezzar as the builder of this wonder, whether or not he truly raised terraces of greenery. The persistence of the story shows how closely his name was tied to construction, to grand visions of architecture, to the very idea of transforming Babylon into a marvel. A people does not attach such a legend to a forgettable ruler. They attach it to one whose legacy already loomed large, whose works were already so astonishing that another layer of wonder seemed almost natural. Imagine the old king in his final days, sitting in a shaded courtyard, the hot wind moving slowly through reed blinds. He is surrounded by scribes reading lists of tribute, priests bringing reports from temples, and builders describing yet another project. His hair is gray, his body slower, but his gaze still steady. He knows the weight of years and the inevitability of death, but he also knows that he leaves behind a city transformed. When at last he died, his burial was likely solemn, attended by priests and officials, carried out with rituals meant to ensure his passage into the afterlife. The details are lost to us, for the records are fragmentary. But the silence of history allows us to imagine a procession moving slowly through Babylon streets, incense drifting, drums sounding in measured rhythm. The people would have watched, their memories heavy with the sight of the only ruler many had ever known. Nebuchadnezzar's story did not end with his death. It lived on in bricks, in ruins, in legends. Later empires remembered him as both builder and conqueror. Later storytellers placed him in visions and prophecies. To some, he was a man of pride and destruction. To others, a king of order and endurance. In truth, he was both like Babylon itself, glorious and fragile, powerful and impermanent. Today, when we hear his name, we may think first to the Hanging Gardens, that elusive wonder. Whether real or imagined, those gardens symbolize the very essence of his reign, the ambition to build not merely for survival, but for awe. A king who ruled long, built endlessly, and left behind a city that even in ruin continues to whisper its stories to us. And so, as the twilight of Nebuchadnezzar's reign settles in our minds, we can rest with a sense of continuity. Empires rise, kings fall, but the memory of what they built endures, softened by time, distant yet strangely close, like a dream from which we wake, carrying only fragments, yet somehow still feeling its weight. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Few names in history carry so much wonder and so much uncertainty. When later writers listed the 7 wonders of the ancient world, these gardens were always included, placed beside the pyramids of Egypt and the great statue of Zeus at Olympia. And yet, unlike the others, the gardens are elusive. No solid remains have ever been found. No Babylonian text survives to describe them. Their existence floats somewhere between history and legend. Imagine yourself standing at the gates of Babylon in the 5th century BCE. You are a traveler from Greece, perhaps following the Persian royal road eastward. You have heard stories of the city, of its walls so broad that horses can race atop them, of its temples filled with gold. As you approach, you see terraces rising above the walls, covered in greenery. From afar, they seem almost like a mountain within the plain. Palm trees sway, vines trail downward, flowers spill in color. In the distance, you think you hear water trickling. The desert heat presses against your skin, but the sight of greenery brings a sense of relief, a dreamlike oasis within stone. That is how many imagine the Hanging Gardens. And yet the truth is much less clear. The earliest detailed accounts of the gardens come not from Babylonians, but from Greek historians centuries later, writers like Strabo and Diodorus. They described rising terraces supported by stone vaults, watered by ingenious machines that lifted water from the river to the highest levels. Some said they were built by Nebuchadnezzar for his wife, who longed for the mountains of her homeland. Others suggested they were constructed even earlier by a queen named Semiramis. And still, when archaeologists dug at Babylon in the 19th and 20th centuries, they found no evidence that matched these descriptions. They found massive walls, vast palaces, and temple foundations, but no trace of stone vaults or terrace gardens. Babylon's soil revealed much, but not the wonder we expected. This absence of evidence led scholars to debate. Were the gardens ever real, or were they a legend, a story invented by later writers to capture the spirit of Babylon's grandeur? Perhaps they were a memory of some other structure, misremembered and retold until it became a marvel of its own. Or perhaps they were real, but built not at Babylon at all. Some modern historians point to Nineveh, the Assyrian capital farther north. Inscriptions from the reign of King Sennacherib, who ruled in the early 7th century BCE, describe lush gardens built with advanced irrigation. His engineers even developed a system of aqueducts and stone channels to carry water long distances. Could it be that the Greek writers saw or heard of these gardens and later confused them with Babylon? The theory is compelling, for Sennacherib's records are detailed, and his constructions were immense. And yet the legend remains fixed at Babylon, tied to the name of Nebuchadnezzar. Perhaps because his reign was remembered as the pinnacle of Babylon's glory. Perhaps because the city itself became a symbol of majesty and mystery, so that any wonder, whether real or not, seemed fitting to place there. The uncertainty itself is part of the fascination. When we imagine the Hanging Gardens, we are not only picturing plants and stone, we are picturing the way memory works, the way stories bend and reshape reality. Something must have inspired the tales. Something green and remarkable stood in the imagination of travelers. But exactly what it was, we may never know. Close your eyes and picture for yourself. High terraces of brick, lined with palm trunks and reeds, layered with soil to hold roots. Vines curling downward, blossoms bright against the brown and blue of Babylon's walls. Birds perched among branches, their songs echoing softly against stone. The hum of insects, the coolness of shade, the scent of damp earth carried on the dry desert air. Above all, the gentle sound of water, lifted by unknown means, spilling quietly from one level to the next. It may be legend, it may be history, but in your imagination it is real. The gardens rise before you, and Babylon becomes more than brick and dust. It becomes a place of wonder, softened by greenery, shimmering with possibility. The Hanging Gardens remind us of something simple, that history is not only what was built, but also what was dreamed. Even if we never find a trace of them, they endure in stories. And perhaps that endurance is their true achievement. For centuries, the Hanging Gardens lived only in the words of classical writers. But when European travelers reached the ruins of Babylon in the 18th and 19th centuries, they arrived with a question. Where were the gardens? The city itself was already reduced to scattered mounds of brick and dust. The Euphrates had shifted course over time, leaving parts of the old city stranded far from water. Villagers dug into the ruins for building material, and many of the great walls had collapsed into little more than low ridges along the plain. Still, the memory of Babylon loomed large. To stand upon its remains was to walk in the shadow of legends. Early explorers, filled with both curiosity and romantic expectation, scanned the ground for signs of stone vaults or irrigation devices. They believed they might uncover terraces where the gardens once stood. Yet at first, little appeared beyond broken bricks and shards of clay tablets. In the mid-19th century, Austin Henry Layard and later Hormizd Rassam, names familiar in the history of archaeology, turned their efforts northward to Assyria. In Nineveh, they uncovered the palace of Sennacherib, and with it inscriptions describing a wondrous garden watered by aqueducts. Here, they found carvings that seemed to show trees growing on terraces, with water flowing beneath them. Could these be the Hanging Gardens? The thought took hold. Later, in Babylon itself, German archaeologist Robert Koldewey undertook excavation from 1899 to 1917. His work transformed our knowledge of the city. He uncovered the massive walls described by ancient authors, the Grand Ishtar Gate glazed with deep blue tiles, and the foundations of Nebuchadnezzar's palaces. But the gardens continued to elude him. Koldewey believed he had finally found them when he unearthed a strange series of vaulted rooms built of stone, a rarity in Babylon, where mud brick was the usual material. These vaults lay near the southern palace, and they seemed strong enough to support terraces above. Koldewey suggested that these chambers might once have been filled with soil and plants, supported by the vaults below. Water could have been raised by a chain pump system from the river nearby. For many decades, his theory stood as the best guess. Textbooks and museum displays repeated the idea. The gardens had been found, though only in their bare structure. But later scholars pointed out problems. The vaults Koldewey discovered may have served another purpose, storage, or perhaps part of a defensive structure. There was no sign of irrigation machinery, no channels for water, no soil layers thick enough to support trees. The evidence was thin. This left historians in a peculiar position. The more we dug, the more we found of Babylon's grandeur. Yet the very thing it was most famous for remained invisible. One of the seven wonders, and yet it left no certain trace. The pyramid still rises in Egypt. The ruins of the Temple of Artemis still stand at Ephesus, but Babylon's wonder exists only in descriptions. This mystery raised another possibility. Perhaps the gardens were never here at all. Perhaps they were in Nineveh, where inscriptions and reliefs give us firmer evidence. Sennacherib's engineers had carved channels through mountains, building stone aqueducts that still stand today, carrying water across valleys. They described planting rare trees and fragrant shrubs, creating an artificial paradise for the Assyrian king. To many scholars, this sounded far more like the gardens described by later Greeks than anything yet uncovered at Babylon. But if so, why did the story shift southward? Some suggest that as Babylon grew in fame under Nebuchadnezzar, travelers confused the cities. To Greeks, distant eastern capitals could blur together, each a seat of kings, each rich with marvels. Over time, the memory of Assyria's gardens may have been absorbed into the legend of Babylon. Others resist this idea. They point out that even if Nebuchadnezzar's gardens have not been found, it does not mean they never existed. Archaeology is an imperfect science. Rivers move, soil shifts, centuries bury what was once visible. It is entirely possible that the true remains lie hidden under unexcavated ground, or washed away by the wandering Euphrates. What strikes us most as we consider these debates is not only the question of truth, but the persistence of desire. Century after century, people have gone searching for the gardens, not only with shovels, but with imagination. The absence of proof only fuels the mystery. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing beside one of Coldway's vaulted rooms. The stone is cool beneath your hand, heavy and enduring. Above you, perhaps there once was soil, trees, flowers swaying in the breeze. Perhaps birds nested there and water flowed. Or perhaps not. The silence of the ruins does not answer. And in that silence, our minds wander, filling in what is missing, building terraces in the air where none remain. The Hanging Gardens, whether in Babylon or Nineveh, whether real or only dreamed, remind us of the fragility of memory. Wonders may be built in stone, yet vanish from history's grasp, leaving us to reconstruct them from fragments. And in this way, the search for the gardens becomes a reflection of our own curiosity. We seek what is lost, knowing we may never find it. And in the seeking, we create stories that endure. When we step back from a search for ruins and irrigation channels, another truth emerges. The Hanging Gardens mattered not only as a structure of stone and soil, but as a vision. They were remembered for centuries because of what they represented, not merely because of what they were. In ancient Mesopotamia, gardens were not simply decorative spaces. They were symbols of power, luxury, and the king's ability to master nature. The rivers that brought life to the plains also brought floods and uncertainty. To contain water, to lift it, and to turn it into carefully ordered beauty was an act of dominion. A ruler who created a lush garden in the desert was demonstrating that his power reached not only over men, but over the very elements. This is why the gardens lingered in memory. Even if travelers never saw them, the idea of a ruler commanding green terraces in a barren land was compelling. It spoke of wealth so vast that it could transform the climate itself. It suggested a paradise set apart from the common world. In Mesopotamian myths, gardens were often linked with the divine. There were stories of sacred groves where gods dwelled, or where kings received visions. To walk in such a space was to step closer to eternity. Later, in Hebrew scripture, the image of Eden carried similar associations. A fertile, enclosed garden where human beings were once at peace with the divine. And in later Islamic culture, the very word paradise would derive from the Persian concept of an enclosed garden, shaded, watered, filled with delight. The Hanging Gardens thus became more than a single wonder. They became an archetype. They embodied the human longing to recover a perfect garden, to create harmony between earth and heaven. As Greek and Roman writers described them, they seemed almost dreamlike. Strabo, the geographer, imagined vaulted terraces ascending like a green mountain, each level covered in trees. Diodorus described it as a marvel built not only for beauty, but as a cure for homesickness, recalling the mountain landscapes of a queen's homeland. These accounts blended fact and myth, weaving the gardens into a tapestry of romance. By the Middle Ages, when classical texts were copied in monasteries, the Hanging Gardens lived on in manuscripts. Scribes who had never seen Babylon still decorated margins with fanciful illustrations, towers covered in vines, rivers flowing upward, strange machines lifting water. To the medieval imagination, the gardens were not simply history. They were part of a timeless world of marvels, alongside dragons, phoenixes, and far-off lands of wonder. Even in modern times, the gardens endure as a symbol. They appear in paintings, novels, and films, often depicted as a utopia lost to time. They stand for the fragile balance between nature and civilization, and for the longing humans feel for beauty in unlikely places. What makes the story especially soothing as we consider it late at night is that the gardens are a paradox. They may never have existed as described, and yet they are perhaps the most famous of all the seven wonders. Their reality lies not in brick and root, but in memory. And memory, after all, is where most wonders live. If you imagine yourself walking in such a garden, you need not ask whether it truly stood in Babylon, or in Nineveh, or nowhere at all. You need only notice the quiet, the shade of a tree overhead, the sound of unseen water steady and calm, a soft fragrance on the air. These details live in imagination, but imagination is enough. In this way, the hanging gardens invite us not to solve them, but to rest in them. They are not a puzzle to be finished, but a story to return to, gentle, mysterious, and endless. The story of the gardens, passed from traveler to scribe, from clay tablet to parchment, from parchment to printed page, and now to your ears as you drift towards sleep, is proof that some wonders need not be touched to be real. They endure because we continue to picture them. And so, the hanging gardens live on, not as walls or terraces, but as a quiet symbol of humanity's wish for peace, beauty, and the soft embrace of nature within the noise of empire. In imagining the hanging gardens, it is natural to picture them not simply as architecture, but as a place inhabited, who walked among the shaded terraces, who had the right to sit beneath the palms while servants poured water into shining bowls, or musicians played in the cool of the evening. To answer these questions, we must turn our attention to the social fabric of Babylon itself and consider how gardens, palaces, and power intertwined. Babylon was not a small city. By the time of Nebuchadnezzar II, it stretched across miles of land, with great double walls, bronze gates, and avenues lined with statues. Within this immense structure, life varied greatly depending on who you were. For the royal household and the aristocracy, daily life revolved around privilege, ritual, and display. The hanging gardens, if they truly existed in the heart of the city, would have been a private domain, visited not by ordinary citizens, but by the king, his family, high-ranking courtiers, and foreign guests. The palace itself was a vast labyrinth of rooms, halls, and courtyards. Clay tablets suggest that the royal kitchens employed countless workers to prepare bread, stews, roasted meats, and delicacies flavored with honey and dates. For the king and his household, meals were as much a performance as sustenance, eaten from fine vessels, with musicians and entertainers providing a constant background of song. The gardens, then, would have extended this aura of wealth into a setting of cultivated nature. To walk on a terrace lined with flowering shrubs was to demonstrate mastery. Mastery over labor, over water, and over the very seasons. Visitors from other lands would have recognized immediately that such abundance, set within otherwise arid plains, was no ordinary sight. It spoke of imperial strength. Imagine yourself, if you like, strolling through one of these imagined terraces. The air is softer than in the streets outside, shaded by vines and leaves. Servants move quietly with pitchers of water. Somewhere, a court poet recites a hymn to the gods, his words drifting across the stillness. The rhythm of elite life was one of display, the constant assertion that here, at the center of empire, order had triumphed over chaos. But contrast this scene with the lives lived beyond the palace walls. For ordinary Babylonian families, existence was steady but fragile. Most people lived in simple brick houses, crowded together along narrow lanes. They worked as laborers, artisans, scribes, or merchants, their lives ruled by the cycle of the rivers. Floods and droughts shaped their fates far more directly than the ornamental flow of water in the gardens, where the elite enjoyed imported luxuries. Ivory, lapis, fragrant oils. The majority relied on lentils, onions, barley, and fish from the river. And yet, the contrast was not total separation. Even for common people, gardens were not entirely unknown. Many families tended small courtyards or grew herbs in jars, coaxing green life from the clay soil. Such spaces were not as grand as the terraces of the palace, but they held the same quiet satisfaction. The wish to transform barren land into shaded rest was a universal impulse, whether for king or for laborer. This difference between the vast engineered gardens of the elite and the modest household plots of ordinary Babylonians reveals something about the nature of power itself. The king's garden proclaimed dominance, a wonder of the world. A family's courtyard garden whispered resilience, a private retreat. Both, however, were part of the same continuum of life in the city. Even scribes, those who served the bureaucracy of empire, recorded the significance of gardens in metaphor. To be compared to a well-watered tree was to be blessed. To live in dryness was to be forgotten. In clay tablets, curses often wished that an enemy's canal would dry up or that his roots would wither. The language of cultivation was the language of life and death. In this way, the hanging gardens, whether myth or reality, fit seamlessly into Babylonian society. They embodied the aspirations of the elite, who sought to show their dominion, and mirrored the hopes of ordinary citizens, who longed for a patch of shade in the sun. They were, in their grandeur, both a contrast to daily life and an exaggerated reflection of it. As we imagine this world, you may feel a certain calm in the contrasts themselves. The hush of the terraces above, the hum of the markets below, the gleam of gold, the roughness of clay. Babylon contained them all, and the gardens, true or not, offered a symbol of both distance and connection between the rulers who commanded abundance and the people who endured within it. And so, the gardens were not merely a marvel of engineering or myth. They were a stage on which the drama of social difference was performed quietly, endlessly across the centuries. To understand the separation between the privileged life of Babylon's rulers and the experiences of its common people, we must linger a little longer in the rituals and rhythms that filled their days. Babylon was not merely a city of walls and canals. It was a theater of ceremony, a place where divine order was made visible in processions, feasts, and sacred rites. The most significant of these rituals was the New Year festival, known as the Akitu. Lasting more than 10 days, it was one of the grandest events in the ancient world. The god Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, was at the center of the celebrations. Priests carried his statue through the city in a procession that filled the streets with music, chanting, and offerings. For the people, this was a moment of renewal, when chaos was symbolically pushed back and the cycle of life was affirmed once again. For the royal family and their elite circle, however, the Akitu festival had another dimension. It was also a demonstration of their closeness to the gods. The king himself took part in rituals that emphasized his role as the chosen guardian of Marduk's city. He was humbled before the statue of the god, reminded of his duties, and then reinstated as ruler for the year ahead. Such moments were staged both for spiritual meaning and for political reassurance. Imagine the city during this time. Along the great processional way, crowds gathered shoulder to shoulder, their sandals pressing into the dust, their voices rising in prayer. Flags, flowers, and ornaments decorated the walls. At the head of the parade, priests chanted verses in ancient Akkadian, their tones measured and deliberate, while incense drifted into the hot air. And within the palace walls, the hanging gardens, if they existed, would have offered a retreat for the king after such public display, a private sanctuary where only a select few could follow. The contrast between public ritual and private leisure was striking. While the people experienced the festival as a collective act, in crowded streets and temple courtyards, the elite retreated into enclosed gardens, where songbirds sang among the leaves and water trickled from carefully designed channels. This juxtaposition tells us something about Babylonian society. Abundance and privacy were not shared equally, but were instead markers of rank. Outside of festivals, ordinary leisure for the majority of Babylonians was simple. Families gathered in courtyards, told stories, shared meals of bread and dates, and listened to traveling entertainers who recited tales of gods and heroes. Children played games with clay tokens or small carved toys, while adults drank beer brewed from barley, a staple of daily life. Life was not without its pleasures, though they were modest and communal. By contrast, members of the elite enjoyed luxuries imported from across the empire. Records describe fine textiles, perfumes, carved ivory, and elaborate feasts with exotic foods. Music, too, played a central role in elite leisure. Harps, lyres, and flutes filled the halls of the palace. Dancers performed at banquets, and poets recited hymns not only to the gods, but also in praise of kings. The gardens themselves may have been used as a stage for such performances. Picture a summer evening on a terrace platform, with lanterns hung along the balustrades. Courtiers recline on cushions, servants move silently with trays of fruit and wine, and musicians strum gentle notes against the backdrop of flowing water. Beyond the walls, the streets of the city lie dark and quiet, ordinary households preparing for rest. The contrast could not have been sharper, and yet, even in their differences, both elite and common life shared a devotion to rhythm and cycle. The rising of the sun, the flooding of the rivers, the cycle of planting and harvest, these shaped every household. In this sense, the king's lavish gardens were a magnified reflection of what every Babylonian sought: continuity, abundance, and a measure of peace within the uncertainties of life. There's a kind of calm in realizing this. The distinction between rulers and ruled was great, but beneath it all lay the same desire for shade, for food, for safety, and for beauty. The elite expressed it through towering terraces, while common people expressed it through a clay pot of herbs by the doorway. Both were responses to the same human longing. So, as you let your mind drift, picture the city on one of these festival nights. The roar of the crowd has faded. The fires of the temples burn low. In the gardens above, nobles whisper to one another, reclining under vines. In the narrow streets below, families settle in for rest. The layers of the city breathe together, one atop another, each living its own version of Babylon. As the story of Babylon unfolds, it becomes clear that the city was not a single voice, but a chorus. The voices of the elite, preserved in inscriptions and palace art, speak of divine favor, victory, and splendor. The voices of the priests, captured in ritual texts, echo the eternal rhythms of the heavens. The voices of commoners are harder to hear, recorded only in fragmentary contracts, scribbled notes, or traces of pottery left in modest homes. Together, these fragments form a mosaic showing a city alive with both unity and division. At the very top of society was the king, styled not only as ruler, but as shepherd, judge, and protector. His family and closest allies formed the uppermost circle, enjoying privileges few could even imagine. Their palaces were richly adorned, their tables heavy with imported goods, and their gardens, real or symbolic, stood as a mark of distinction. For them, life was a stage, every action meant to demonstrate power and proximity to the gods. Below the king stood the priestly caste, whose authority stemmed not from land or soldiers, but from ritual knowledge. They kept the calendar, guided the planting seasons, and read omens in the stars. Their words could steady the heart of a fearful farmer or sway the decisions of a ruler. They were the custodians of continuity, ensuring that Marduk's favor never wavered. Merchants, artisans, and scribes formed a bustling middle layer. The scribes in particular were crucial, for they held the skill of writing, an art that few possessed. They recorded debts, treaties, poems, and prayers, making them the silent architects of history. Merchants carried goods from distant lands, their caravans trailing across desert roads, bringing ivory, spices, and precious stones into Babylon's markets. Artisans shaped clay, carved stone, and wove textiles, filling both humble homes and lavish palaces with their work. For common farmers and laborers, daily life was more fragile. Their wealth depended on the rhythm of the rivers, the cooperation of the seasons, and the fairness of overseers. They were the ones who carried the weight of building projects, who brought the harvest to the storehouses, who bore the burdens that supported the grandeur of the city. Many lived in small, single-room houses, walls of mud brick that baked hard in the sun and softened in the rains. Beyond them, at the lowest edge of the social order, were the enslaved and the foreign captives of war. Their stories often remain silent in the records, yet we know they were present, in kitchens, in quarries, in workshops, and perhaps even in the tending of gardens that kings claimed as their own. Their lives remind us of the steep price of empire, paid not in silver, but in human labor and longing. And yet, despite these layers of inequality, Babylon presented itself as a whole. In festivals, in marketplaces, in the steady cycle of the year, the city breathed as one. The king needed the farmer's grain. The farmer needed the priest's blessing. The priest needed the artisan's offerings, and the artisan needed the merchant's wares. It was a system of interdependence, even when the rewards were unevenly shared. The Hanging Gardens, whether legend or reality, become almost a perfect metaphor for this society. Terraced high above the city, the gardens symbolize the elevated life of the few, lush and carefully watered. Yet beneath those terraces lay the unseen workers, the engineers, the laborers, the servants, who maintained the flow of water, carried the soil, and tended the plants. The gardens, in this sense, were not only a monument to grandeur, but also to contrast. The visible beauty of power resting upon the invisible labor of many. It is this contrast that has given Babylon such a lasting place in human imagination. Ancient visitors wrote of marvels that seemed beyond belief. Later generations, especially Greek historians, cast the city as both wondrous and decadent, a place of splendor and downfall. Even today, the memory of Babylon carries dual meanings. It is at once a symbol of achievement and a cautionary tale of pride. When you reflect on this, you may picture the city as layers in the night. At the very top, torchlight flickers in palace courtyards. Below, the priest lights a lamp before a statue. In a courtyard house, a mother tells her child a story before bed. And in the darkness at the city's edge, workers sleep exhausted, knowing they must rise again with the dawn. All are part of the same city, the same story, each living within their own circle of light. There is something strangely calming in recognizing this pattern. Civilizations rise with their kings, their festivals, their gardens. They fade, leaving behind only fragments, stories, and ruins. Yet the rhythm continues, the human search for beauty and belonging echoing across centuries. As you drift with these thoughts, allow yourself to rest in that rhythm, the quiet certainty that, while lives differ, they are all woven into a single fabric. And so, we find ourselves at the end of this long, meandering journey through the legendary city of Babylon. We began with its gardens, those terraces of greenery said to hang in the air, watered by ingenious designs or by the patient hands of laborers. We wandered through the streets, alongside merchants and scribes, pausing to imagine the rhythms of ordinary life. We listened for the voices of kings, priests, and poets, and we considered the silent presence of those whose stories were rarely written down. All of it, fact, memory, legend, blends together in a single tapestry, much like the woven cloths Babylonian artisans once created from wool and linen. The threads are not all the same. Some are golden, shining with triumph and ambition. Others are coarse, carrying the weight of hardship and obscurity. Yet together they form a pattern, intricate and enduring. That pattern is what has carried Babylon into the centuries, what has kept its name alive long after its bricks crumbled back into dust. As you listen, perhaps you sense the gentle repetition of history itself. Civilizations rise, their monuments reaching for the heavens, their rulers declaring permanence. Yet time has its own pace, slow and unyielding. Babylon too fell, leaving behind broken walls and scattered fragments. But from those fragments, new stories grew, retold by travelers, reshaped by scholars, and now carried even here to your quiet evening. There's something calming in this cycle, to know that the struggles and triumphs of the past, however grand or painful, have become part of the great rhythm of human memory. To know that what once seemed eternal now rests in silence, offering us not anxiety, but perspective. The gardens, whether they truly stood in brick and soil or only in the imagination of poets, remain a perfect symbol of this. Their beauty may never be fully proven. Their details may forever elude us. Yet the dream of them endures. A dream of greenery above the desert, of cool shade where heat reigns, of order and artistry rising from dust. Perhaps it is not their physical presence, but their imagined possibility that gives them their lasting power. Now, as the story draws to its close, allow yourself to drift into that same quiet rhythm. Imagine the Euphrates flowing softly in the night, its waters glimmering under starlight. Imagine torches flickering on distant walls, their lights swaying and then fading. Imagine a hush settling over the gardens, real or imagined, leaves rustling softly as the city sleeps below. If this long and gentle history has brought you even a little rest, I invite you to let me know. You can like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share where and when you're listening. It is strangely comforting to know who else is out there across the world falling asleep to the same old stories. Your presence, even unspoken, becomes part of this quiet circle of listeners. And now, you need not think any further. Let go of the weight of details, of names and dates and questions. They will still be here tomorrow. Tonight, let your mind settle into stillness, the same stillness that has gathered around ruins for centuries. The same stillness that covers the earth each night, no matter where you are. Sleep well, dear listener. May your rest be calm, your dreams gentle, and may the whisper of ancient gardens accompany you into sleep.